Good evening and welcome to our Fulton Bible Institute class. We appreciate you joining us here as we begin a new semester. We are continuing our study through the Old Testament. You remember last semester we got through the end of the history books to Esther. We tried to finish Esther, but didn't quite make it. So tonight we're going to pick back up with Esther, and we're going to look at Esther and Job. That is our plan for this evening, and then we plan from there to go on from there to the rest of this quarter to continue studying the Old Testament, continue to study these books. And we're going to take a little slower time this time because these books are a lot different than the history books. So we appreciate you though joining us. And like I say, if you'd like the notes for our class, please let us know. We're going to share those on our Facebook page. We'll also be able to mail those out to anybody who needs those. And again, if you haven't seen our old class, you can go back on our YouTube or our Facebook page, and you can find those videos from last semester to catch up. We appreciate you joining us here. And that's as far as introduction goes, that's all I have. So if you would, let's start and let's study through the book of Esther. You remember we talked about Esther, or we got through the idea of Esther takes place at the end of the captivity. It's actually after the captivity is over. You remember as we talked about that, the kings of Israel fell, and they were taken away into captivity, into Babylon. There they lived in Babylon for 70 years. We'll talk about that when we get to the prophets again. And as we talked about that, we began to talk about people who went back. There were three major returns from Babylon, and were actually Persia at that time, back to Jerusalem. The first was under Zerubbabel, who would go back, and he was in the line of David. He would go back, and he would be the successor, the governor of the land. And we'll get to know him more this semester. As well as that, after that, there was the time of Ezra. Ezra went back, took a second group back. Ezra took a second group back to Israel and to Jerusalem, and he set up what his changes were. And then finally, at the end of Ezra, we see, or the end of the third return, was Nehemiah, when he went back and rebuilt the wall. And so when we look at the book of Esther, Esther happens in the middle of Ezra. It happens in between chapter 6 and 7. There's about a 50-year gap between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, between Zerubbabel going back and Ezra going back. So it's in between those two time periods that we see what happens here with Esther. Now, as far as looking at Esther and looking at what it does, we'll start by looking at this great book and what it means. The book of Esther is titled after its main character. This is named after Esther the queen. The name Esther was a Persian name, and it means star. Her name is also recorded here in Esther chapter 2, verse 7, as being Hadassah. That is her Jewish name, meaning myrtle. Now, Esther is a very interesting book in that it is one of the books in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God, doesn't mention God in its text, but God is seen throughout this book as being there in his providential care. And so God gives the providential care of delivering Israel amongst danger and deliverance, amongst the danger and the trying times that were coming. And so this is sort of the setting we have of Esther as we begin to look at this. Now, Esther is a very important book in the Old Testament as far as Jews were concerned because it was very popular to name your girls Hadassah. And that was based on what we know of Queen Esther and her recognition and what she was able to accomplish. So as we begin to talk about the book of Esther, we'll look here that what happens in the story of Esther is that the Jews here face the threat of their lives before enjoying triumph, as God strategically placed Esther in this far country. Now, we're going to see that as we progress to the book of Esther. I'm assuming you know the story of Esther, but we're going to see that the Jews were faced with extinction. They're faced with with genocide. And God strategically puts Esther in a place that's able to save his people. And we're going to see that play out in this book. Esther was written after 465 BC. This is hinted at in chapter 10, verse 2, of giving us a date. This is after the fall of King Xerxes, and then we see that this is written in the 5th century at Shushan, the capital of the Persian Empire. This is written from the Persian Empire and written from that capital. It covers a 10-year period. It fell chronologically between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And so the author of Esther is unknown. Excuse me, I'll keep calling it Ezra if I'm not careful. But author of Esther is unknown. Most people think it may be Ezra. Some people think it could be Mordecai. But what we do know about this, whoever wrote this book, we know a few things about him. Number one, is evident that it's evident that the author lived in Persia during this time. The author will give some insights, some descriptions that only an eyewitness would see, that only an eyewitness could be able to talk about. And he will give specific details and intimate knowledge of Esther, Mordecai, the court, and the furnishings of the palace. Whoever writes this book had to know some things, some very important things, very key things about the Persian Empire, know about the palace, know about Esther, know about Mordecai. And so some people think Mordecai himself may have wrote this book. But again, we really don't know, and it really doesn't matter who wrote the book, just that we know the book was written by God's inspiration and written for us to know. Now, as we continue studying the book of Ezra, we're going to see that the palace where the story of Esther occurs was destroyed by fire in 435 BC. So this is why we say it's about in this time period, because we know when it is. Now, what's interesting about this is that the palace is destroyed in 435 BC. It's later rebuilt, but archaeologists have went back to dig up the palace that was burnt, and part of the archaeological finds that have been found have backed up the story of Esther. And not only that, there was also a historian by the name of Herodotus who wrote about this time and wrote about the Persian Empire. And in writing about this Persian Empire, he gives some historical accounts, gives some historical facts that matches with the book of Esther, that matches with the same story, the same outline, same general concepts that Esther says and Esther has that would have happened there. And so Esther gives the only biblical portrait we have of the condition of the Jews who remained in Persia. And we're going to see that feasting was very prominent in Esther. So Esther is a very interesting point because it's the only book that we have that gives this the portrait of what life was like outside of Jerusalem for the Jews in the Babylonian captivity. Now, we have Daniel, a little bit about what happens here, but Esther's more about what happens in Persia. And so this is for those who remain. Those who didn't go back was Zerubbabel, and those who may have later went back was Ezra and Nehemiah, but at this time had not went back and had chosen to stay. So we look at this idea, and this is sort of our introduction to the book of Esther, to look at what Esther's about. So let's look at the outline of Esther. We begin in Esther chapter 1, beginning the first 9 verses. We see the book of Esther opens with the scene of a great banquet at the king's palace at Susa. Most people date this to the third reign of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and the reason we have two different names is Ahasuerus is his Persian name, Xerxes is his Greek name. And so Xerxes has this banquet. Most people, again, date this to about his third year of reigning as king. And what this banquet is for is this is a very famous banquet that he has to decide, to debate whether or not the Persian Empire can take on the Greeks. He's preparing to go to Greece, and he's preparing to fight the Greeks. And as he's getting ready for this battle, for this fight, he calls this feast together of his great nobles to discuss and figure out what they can do and what they can accomplish. And it's during this feast in the verse 11 through 12, or 10 to 12 of chapter 1, that the drunken king demands that his queen Vashti comes to him. That she comes, and not just that she comes, but that she comes and she parades herself. She goes out and displays her beauty for all the men at the feast to see. Again, a bunch of drunken men. Vashti is a woman of integrity, a woman of honor, in that she refuses. Vashti refuses to go out, and again, this is a major thing for a queen to refuse the king's order. For anybody to refuse the king's order was paramount to death, paramount to execution. But Vashti makes this decision not to go out. And so what happens is that Vashti, after her refusal, she is dethroned. She is removed from the throne. You remember it's sort of an interesting thing because Xerxes or Ahasuerus' council, his wise men, come to him and say, King, you know you're setting a bad standard here. That if Vashti could disrespect you, and she doesn't suffer, she's not punished for it, that's going to set a bad standard for all the other women in the kingdom. That all the other women in the kingdom, they're going to follow in Vashti's steps. And so Vashti is dethroned. And then starting in chapter 2, within the few years, a search for a new queen begins. And it's in chapter 2 we begin to meet our main characters of Esther and Mordecai. In Esther chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, and it's going through verse 11, we find out there's a young woman by the name of Esther who is considered to be in the running for a queen. And we get the story of Esther, and we find out about her uncle Mordecai, who's taking care of her. And from there, we begin to see what happens with Esther. In Esther chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, we see that Esther is eventually chosen to be the queen. She goes through this. Esther's very competent in what she does, very, very well-deserving, well-liked, faithful woman in how she goes through this process. A very smart woman. And so she's eventually chosen by the king to be the queen. And as she is queen, in Esther chapter 2, verse 19 through 23, her uncle Mordecai, the one we introduced earlier, learns of a plot against the king. He learns about the plan by some of the king's men to assassinate him. And so Mordecai tells Esther about this plot. Esther then tells the king, and when the king hears about this, his life is saved. He takes the appropriate actions, and his life is saved. Now, this plays part a little later in the story, so it's very interesting how this works. And again, this shows us about God's providence, that things happen, especially in the book of Esther, for a reason. It's not just by chance, or by just some odd chance. So as we see, Esther chapter 3, verse 1. As time proceeds, there's our fourth character introduced in the story. The main characters, as we said, are Esther, Mordecai, King Ahasuerus, and we're introduced to Haman, the bad guy, the villain of the story. At a later time, Haman is elevated by the king to the high rank of Grand Vizier. He's the right-hand man to the king among the princes. He's lifted up above all the others. And as given his place of honor, the people were to bow down before him. The people were to bow when he came into their presence. This was a mark of honor, a mark of privilege for him. Well, the problem is that for whatever reason, we're not told, but Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Mordecai refuses to honor him, refuses to give him this honor that he has been given by the king. And thus Haman is upset. Thus Haman is mad at what Mordecai does. So Haman gets so enraged that he determines to eradicate or exterminate Mordecai's entire race. He decides he's going to put to death all of the Jews. He's going to kill all the Jewish people. And so word gets out. He sets forth this decree. He uses the king, and the king does this, again, not knowing Esther's heritage. But the king goes forth, and he sends out this decree. And what happens is that Haman decides a certain day that he's going to execute the Jews, a certain day, a certain month. And he does it by casting lots. Now, the word lot here is pur, P-U-R. We'll talk about that in just at the end of this story, because that has a very interesting tie back into this. But he casts lots, and he comes to a certain month, and he casts lots to come to a certain day. And the thing is, the days and the months he come to is down the road. It's a pretty good gap between when he decides to do this versus when it's going to come to pass. And so he gets the king to sign this decree that on this certain month, I think it's the month of Adar, on the 13th, 13th day, I believe it is, that the people of Israel the Jews are going to be put to death. Everybody in the city of Persia is going to be able to kill the Jews. Mordecai gets word about this, and Mordecai pleads with Esther. He pleads with Esther for help, and Esther said, the king's not calling me into his presence. And Esther says that if I go to the king and he doesn't accept me, if he doesn't raise his scepter when you walk into the room uninvited, then you're going to be killed on the spot. And this is where the key point of Esther comes in, where Mordecai tells her that perhaps you were put into the kingdom, perhaps you were given this position for such a time as this. Perhaps this was your calling, perhaps this was your time. And so Esther tells Mordecai and the Jews to pray for it. She's going to the king tomorrow. Chapter 5, she goes into the king. Both Haman and the king are there, and she invites them both to a banquet. As they go to the banquet, or as they're getting ready for that banquet, in chapter 5, the next 5 verses, verses 9 through 14, Haman is rejoicing over his exaltation. He's he is excited, rejoicing over being invited by Esther to this big banquet. And as such, he gets in his mind that he's going to take part in what he's wanting to do, and that is to kill Mordecai. And so he builds a gallows. Now, one interesting thing to note is the gallows here are not the gallows we think about. When we think about gallows, typically we think about hanging someone, hanging them by a noose or hanging them by a rope by the neck. In the ancient world, that was not the gallows. These gallows were, in fact, a big pole with a pointed stick or a pointed end on it that was driven into the ground, and then the person was forced down on top of that. And basically, you impaled them. That's how the gallows worked in the ancient world. When they talk about gallows in the book of Esther, this is a gallows that's impaling you, not a gallows that hangs you. And so, this happens. Haman builds the gallows. The king goes home or to his palace and to his room, and he can't sleep. And after he has a sleepless night, he calls in some of his court to come and read his court annals. He comes to read the history of his nation, to read about what has occurred and what has happened in his nation. And as he goes, as they come in, they read this. They begin to read about what's happening. And in Esther 6, 2-3, the court annals are read about Mordecai, how Mordecai revealed this plot to put King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes to death. And so the king decides that he asks the reader, has he been rewarded? And they say no. So the next morning, and chapter 6 continues this, Haman shows up to the king's palace, and he asks Haman, he says, Haman, if I've got a man that I really want to honor, really want to lift up, and really want to show what they can do and what a great thing it is for them, what should I do? How can I honor a person? Well, Haman, in the next few verses, suggests that to be honored, he gives an extravagant honor. He says the man should be draped with the king's robe, should be put on a horse, and be carried throughout the city, and people exalt and announce, this is the king's favorite, this is the king's man. And the king hears this, and the king says, yes, that is great, that is what I want to do. And he says, this is what I want you to do, Mordecai. He says, I want you to go out. Mordecai thinking this is for him, Haman thinking this is for him. He tells Haman, you go out and you do this for Mordecai. You go celebrate Mordecai in this way. Well, that puts Haman at a very bad mood. And it says he comes home and fumes about this, but he comes home just in time for Esther's second banquet. And so Haman has to leave, going and parading Mordecai throughout the city to come into Esther. And as he comes into Esther, or as they come into this feast, the king asks Esther, what is this feast for? What do you need? He tells her to give her whatever she asks, and she tells him that they're wanting to kill her people, that people are trying to exterminate her. And the king says, who dares do this? And well, Haman doesn't know who Esther is, and Esther reveals that she's a Jew, and she says Haman is seeking to kill all the Jews. Well, the king is furious, and the king leaves. Well, when the king leaves, Haman realizes the state he's in. He falls down and begs Esther to save him. It says he falls on Esther. Well, the king comes back and sees Haman on Esther, and he assumes Haman's trying to cause Esther harm right then. So Haman is taken out at that very moment, and he's hanged on his own gallows. Again, he's impaled. And as he's impaled on his own gallows, he's put to death. So Haman is this man who is seeking to justify himself, to build himself up, is now suffering on his very gallows. Well, chapter 8, verses 1-2, King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, realizes that he has to fill someone else's to take this grand vizier position, and he gives it to Mordecai. And he gives it to Mordecai, and he begins to talk about what they need to do. And so Mordecai begins to debate this problem. You remember the story of Daniel 6 talks about this very thing. Remember Daniel in the lion's den. In the Persian law, when a law was written, a law was given, you could not change it. It could not be canceled, could not be changed. It was in stone. You had to come up with something else in its place. And so this is what happens. Haman, since he got the king's approval, his law was still in place. And the Jews, even though the king was against it, the Jews were still going to be put to death. So in Esther 8, verse 3 through 14, the Jews, Mordecai then decides, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give the Jews the ability to defend themselves. We're going to send out this edict that says on, again, I think it's the 13th or 14th day of Adar when this was supposed to happen. The Jews are able to defend themselves when someone comes after them. And then also, not only that day, but also the next day. If they still need to defend themselves the next day, they can still do it. And then we see in Esther 8 through Esther 9 that the plot is successful. The plan is successful. The Jews are able to protect themselves. The Jewish nation is saved, and everything is as it needs to be. From there, we go to Esther chapter 9 through Esther 10, where Mordecai and Esther order a Feast of Purim to be observed as a perpetual memorial. And basically what they do is they institute this new feast, a new feast called Purim. Now, you know, as I told you earlier, the word pur, P-U-R, is the Persian word for lot. This is what Haman cast to decide the month and the day. And so they have a feast of these lots, a feast of the salvation of Israel, and a feast that was going to be done yearly. And in this feast, they were going to reread the book of Esther. And so in Esther 10, verse 1 through 3, we see Mordecai there uses his high position for the benefit of his people. He begins to make laws and helps to keep the people well and keep the people going good. And what's interesting about the book of Esther is, according to historians, the Jews held the book of Esther very highly. And in the Christian age, we sometimes don't pay that much attention to Esther. But Esther was one that was very highly regarded and by the Jews because she was one of their saviors. She was one of the ones who saved their people from being exterminated. Now, again, history and Esther match. They don't contradict. They don't have problems. They go hand in hand, and that says a whole lot again about Esther and about what they were able to do. Now, that's the book of Esther. That catches us up from where we were last year. For the rest of our time this evening, we're going to talk about the book of Job. We're going to look at Job real quick and talk about the problem of suffering. Job introduces a new section. As we said, from Joshua to Esther is the story of history. Beginning in Job and going through the Song of Solomon, we're going to see the idea of wisdom literature. And Job is a wisdom literature book, a book of poetry, a book that has a message. Now, let's talk about Job. Again, Job is dealing with the problem of suffering, dealing with the problem of what happens or why does mankind suffer? Why does mankind have trouble? We'll look at this. The book of Job is about an early patriarch who lost everything. He wrestles with the question of why. He wrestles with the question of why a righteous person suffers if God is loving and all-powerful. It begins with a discussion between God and Satan, then moves through 3 cycles of debates between Job and his quote-unquote friends. Job concludes God is always worthy of love and worship regardless of strife. Job blesses the blessings then exceed his losses. And this is the basic outline of Job. The author of Job is never revealed. The underlying theme is that God's wisdom exceeds the wisdom of men. And let's talk about this for a minute. The author of Job, we really don't know. Some people think that Solomon wrote this book, and there's a good possibility it was written during the time of Solomon because this was the typical literature of Solomon. That doesn't mean Job didn't happen. Job probably would have happened. Again, most people date Job or place Job, the historical figure, as being in the time of Abraham. And Jesus will talk about Job, and James will talk about Job. So Job was an actual man. Now, the story of Job may have been passed down. Now, what happens in Job, as we know, is he loses everything, and he begins to question why. And this is going to be the point of the book, is why does God let good things happen to bad, or why does God let bad things happen to good people? And that's the idea. And the overall theme, the conclusion of the book, is that God's wisdom exceeds the wisdom of man. God knows more than we do. We have to just trust him. And that goes on with his next point. Although we cannot always understand God's plan or purpose in permitting us to suffer, he does have a good reason, and he can always be trusted. Thus, we must yield ourselves without reservation, totally committed to God. So this is the point of Job, that we must give ourselves to God, give ourselves to his worship, to his service, to trust him, to trust that he is the God who knows all, who is over all. And there. Now, Job answers a very interesting problem, or deals with a very interesting problem that we still deal with today, and that is the problem of suffering and evil. Some people will say, well, if God's all-powerful and God's all-loving, then why does evil exist? Well, that's because this world is a fallen place. This world is evil. This world has trouble. And so Job answers that question. Now, again, Job doesn't give us the answer we want. It's not that God comes out and gives Job a plain answer. God's answer to Job is not the answer Job wants, but it's the true answer. It's the answer Job has to deal with. So let's look at the outline of Job. Most people, most of us, and I say that because I was this way till I had to take a class on Job. Most of us may not realize that Job is a book of 42 chapters. And I say we may not realize that because most of us know chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 42. That's all we know. We know the first part of Job and we know the end of Job. We don't know the middle. And the middle is where Job is so valuable. Now, let's talk about the beginning. Job 1, 1 through 5. Job is introduced as a pious and prosperous man. He's introduced as a holy man, a righteous man before God. And as such, Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 11, Satan challenges the sincerity of Job's faith. Satan basically comes and says, well, God, Job is just faithful. Job is true to you only because you protect him. Only because you blessed him with family, you blessed him with possessions, you blessed him with all these things. That's the only reason Job is faithful to you. And God says, no, you try Job. You take away everything you can from Job. And then Satan's granted permission to put Job to the test. Remember, God says you can do anything, but you can't touch Job the first time. And that happens. Job loses his children, loses his servants, loses his possessions. Remember, there's only one servant left in all those things that come back and tell him, oh, well, you just had this. And it's just bam, 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 bam. He loses his sheep, loses his goats, loses his camels, loses all of his things. And then he hears that all of his children, 10 children, die in one fatal accident. And Job is put off. And Job sits down. And remember, Job mourns, and Job basically says he comes to the realization that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He realized that what he has is a blessing from God, and that's an odd thing for us to hear and us think about, but it's a very faithful statement, very true statement. Then remember in chapter 2, Satan comes and says, well, I took all his stuff away, but it's because you protected him physically. If he was hurt physically, he would turn away from you. Remember, God says, okay, try him. He says, this time you can do whatever you want to physically, but do not kill him. Don't kill Job. Do whatever else you want to do. And so you remember Satan then causes boils to come up on him, big sores. Sores that Job would have to take broken pottery to dig into it. He has sit in ashes to find comfort. And remember, Job is so distressed, so hurt, that even his wife comes to him and tells him, Job, just curse God and die. Now, we sometimes look at Job's wife and we will give her a hard time of how can Job be this good, faithful man, but yet have a wife who says, curse God and die. Well, you've got to remember something, and this is something we forget sometimes. Job's wife suffered the same things Job did. We're never told that she was a righteous, a holy person. We're never told that she had the faith Job had, but yet she experienced the same things Job experienced. And I think that tells us that she wasn't as strong as Job. That when she calls Job to curse God and die, that's her hurting. That's her suffering. That's her in pain and agony. And Job is able to take it. She's not. And then finally, in the end of chapter 2, Job's 3 friends come to find him. And again, you notice earlier we had friends in quotation marks because friends are very, very loosely. They come to comfort him, but they're not coming to comfort him. They don't offer no comfort because they come to tell Job what's wrong with him. And before they do that, though, the beautiful thing about this, and this is something we talk about, I talk about at funerals, and talk about with someone who is experiencing loss, is that what Job's 3 friends do is the best thing to do, in that they just come and they sit with Job for 7 days, it says, without saying a word. And then they begin to talk, and when they talk and they open their mouths, that's when they mess up. That's when things go crazy. So let's look at what happens in the book of Job. The rest of the book of Job is a book in the form of speeches. There are these 3 men who come to Job, and there's their speeches and Job's speeches. Now, what we begin with in chapter 3 is when chapter 3, Job laments his condition. He laments where he is. He laments what he's suffering. He laments and cries out because of how suffering he is and how hurt he is. And then beginning in chapter 4 and going through chapter 14, you see the first cycle of speeches. Now, the cycle of speeches is, this is how it works. You have these 3 men of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. These 3 men speak, and after each man speaks, Job will respond. Eliphaz will speak, and then Job will respond. Bildad will speak, Job will respond to him. Zophar will speak, and Job will respond to him. And this continues through chapter 31. You have these three cycles of speeches. Chapter 15 to chapter 21 is the second cycle of these speeches. And then chapter 22 to chapter 31 is the third cycle. Now you will notice one difference. In the third cycle, only Eliphaz and Bildad speak, not Zophar. But Job still responds to each one of them. Now, here's the problem we have. With these speeches, this is where we have to be careful with Job, is these speeches are poetic in form and advance several ideas about the source of suffering. They are these men ideas, and this is something that we sometimes don't understand and don't think about, especially when we read the book of Job. When Job says something, if the book of Job says something, it doesn't mean that's God's word. It doesn't mean it's truth. And I guess just say truth, not God's word. Because Job's three friends come to Job, and they tell Job that, and these all three friends agree, that Job is suffering because of his sins. That what Job is going through is because Job has sinned. And they say, Job, admit you've sinned. Repent and admit you have sinned. And they say it'll be okay. That God will forgive you. God will take care of you after you admit that you're just too prideful. Now, the problem with that is that we know in chapter 1, what these three men don't know, God tells us from the beginning what? Job was a righteous and pious man. Job was a sinless man. Or not sinless, he was a righteous, upstanding man. He didn't have this outstanding sin. And so their theology is wrong. And we can, not careful, we can have that same theology, don't we? How many times do you know people who will say, well, if bad things are happening, it must mean you're doing something bad. If a bad thing happens to you, then you're doing something. God is punishing you. And Job says, no. Job says over and over again, no, I am innocent. I have not sinned. I am not in sin. That I don't deserve this. Matter of fact, over and over again, he cries out, if God would only come and talk to me, I would be happy. And I would prove my case before God. And that's what he cries out these three friends. And he sort of gives up arguing with these three friends because they've got their mindset that Job is a sinful man, and therefore that's why Job is suffering. And so from these three men, we move into the next part, which is chapter 32 and following, which introduces a fourth friend. This time there's a young man who appears to have been listening to the previous speeches, but he is disappointed in what has been said. And so he speaks. This man we'll see him in just a second. He comes up with a new idea. Now remember, the other three friends said that if you suffer hardship, if you're having hard times in life, it means that you are sinful, you are evil. The third friend comes up and says, no, he has four sets of speeches. He advances a view that suffering is divine chastening, which serves to bring about good results in a person's life. He says suffering doesn't just happen because you're evil, but God chastens you. God corrects you in this and tries to get you to correct them. And this is, again, more in line with what God's doing, but it's not fully. Because remember, Job is righteous. Job is holy. So this doesn't work. And the four speeches of this man are broken down this way. Chapter 32 and 36 is his first speech. Chapter 34 has his second speech. 35 is third speech. And then 36 to 37 is his fourth speech. And so he speaks without Job interrupting, without Job responding to him. Then we get into the end of the book, chapters 38 through 42. With human wisdom unable to resolve the problem, the voice of God comes to Job. In Job 38 through Job 39, we see God come to Job. God comes to Job in a mighty thunderstorm. A mighty whirlwind comes, and God speaks to Job. And it's very interesting what God does. This is a very interesting book to read because God comes to Job and says, okay, Job, you've been questioning me. You've been wondering why I do this. You've been doubting me. He says, gird up your loins. Get ready to fight because we're fixing to fight. And the term he uses is a term for a type of wrestling they did in the ancient world, sort of like sumo wrestling. You have the big guys who get in a ring and they try to fight and push each other out. Well, this was an ancient form of wrestling in the ancient world. And what they would do is they had gartered their belts up, they had wrapped their robes in their belt, and they would hold on to each other's belt and they'd try to push them out of a ring. And God says, basically, Job, get your girder ready, get your belt ready. He said, because I'm going to put my hands on it, you're going to put your hands on my belt, and we're going to see who's right. I don't know about you, but if God says that to me, then I'm going to be scared, and that's what Job's reaction is. And Job is worried, but God comes into Job, and God doesn't answer Job's question. Remember, Job's question is, why is this happening? To make Job understand, God begins to ask Job about the wonders of this world. He says, Job, were you there when I laid the foundations? Do you know how the stars work? Do you know how the weather works? Do you know how the animals work? Do you know why this animal does that and this animal behaves this way? And he begins to ask Job very natural, common things. As Job, do you know why they do that? Even answers we can't adequately give today, and the answer is no. The answer is no, God, I don't know. I can't know that. And basically what God is doing is God is telling Job, if you can't understand the basics of how this world works, if you can't understand nature, then how in the world do you think you can understand humankind? How in the world do you think you can understand what we do, what I do in this world with mankind, the highest of all creation? And then you have chapter 40, Job admits his frailty before God, that he's unable to answer God's questions. He's unable to answer why this happens. And then we see in chapter 40, God speaks again to Job. And God says, okay, Job, gird up again. Job's already admitted defeat. God says, nope, we're not done yet, Job. And God says, gird up again. And God begins to ask Job about more animals. He begins to question Job about more things and says, Job, can you explain this? Can you understand what's happening here? And again, Job cannot give an answer. And in Job chapter 42, verses 1 through 6, we see these questions bring Job to penitent submission. Job says, God, I cannot answer that. God, you are worthy. You are righteous. You are holy. And so what this whole section points to, what the entire book points to, is this fact. It points to the fact that Job must learn to walk not by faith, or not by sight, but by faith. That he must trust God's faithfulness in things that man cannot understand. He must trust that God is going to work and God is going to complete what he seeks to do. And then finally, Job chapter 42, verses 7 through 9, the book closes with God's rebuke of Job's three friends. God rebukes his three friends, and he tells them, look, you've got it wrong, boys. You're not doing right. Matter of fact, it's very interesting. God tells Job that to make these friends right, Job has to offer sacrifices for them. You ever thought about that? I don't know if you've really thought about the book of Job, but go back and read this. At the end of the day, God calls the man who these guys have been saying is a sinner. These guys said has been done wrong, and God is punishing him. This is the guy God says he's got to offer a sacrifice for you. If you're to be forgiven, if you're to be forgiven, Job's got to do it. And we know the story of Job. Job's not petty. Job's not a low-life man, but Job forgives him. Job offers a sacrifice for them. And then finally, in the end of chapter 42, verses 10 through 17, we read about Job's fortunes are restored. Job's children are restored. He has more children. He has double the livestock. Everything goes back to Job, and Job is a happy man again. And Job and his wife enjoy the blessings of God. And that's sort of the idea. Now, we sometimes think about the beginning and the end of what Job loses and what he gets. That's not the focus of this book. The focus is not that Job was blessed for he followed God. The focus of Job was, why did he suffer? And he suffered for no reason. And I say that again, no cause. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't anything like that. Job suffered, and that's human life. That's the way this world works. That sometimes bad things happen to good people, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's the message of Job, is that all we can do is trust God. Trust God, who is there, who is working, and who will bring us through this time and bring us into the end and bring us into what he wants and how he desires us to be. Tonight, that's as far as we're going to get. Next week, we're going to study the book of Psalms. I appreciate you joining us here tonight and picking back up with our study. Again, we have this class every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. The lessons will be available for any time after that. If you need notes, feel free to contact us. You can write us on Facebook, write us on email, call us. We'd love to get these to you. Again, we hope that everything is going good with you and your family. We hope that you're having a God-blessed week and a God-blessed time. And again, we appreciate you being here. Look forward to the rest of this semester and hope everything continues to go good. But for tonight, we are finished, and we hope to see you all again real soon. Thank you.